Alright, welcome to Native SDK. This is a bootstrap introduction intended to get you quickly up to speed with Native SDK and quickly applying it to real-world problems. In this video, we're going to be dealing with perhaps the most important Native SDK question, which is, should you even be using Native SDK at all? And if so, what sort of problems will Native SDK be most effective for? Then, in future videos, just to give you a preview, what we'll be doing is we'll be dealing with some of the most critical aspects of getting started with Native SDK, like how do you get your data into Native SDK? How can you handle events and make the charts respond to user input? How can you make the chart interact with other elements outside the chart, including, potentially, other charts? And that's a brief taste of what's to come. Today, however, we're tackling the problem of when it's time to bring in Native SDK and when it isn't. So, to answer that, I've created this diagram showing a high-level overview of data visualization so we can see where Native SDK fits into the big picture. I call this the standard box of data visualization, and I give it that name because if you went out and picked some data visualization package completely at random, this is pretty much what you can expect to find no matter what you pick. It's the standard box with any data visualization package. So what does the standard box say? The standard box says that essentially you're going to have one of a few standard data sources, such as standard data files like CSV, Excel files, so forth and so on, or a database, maybe SQL or MongoDB, maybe some other database, or so forth and so on, some relatively common standard data source. And then the standard box says what you want to do with that data source is feed it into the data visualization technology, and then that will output for you one of several standard charts with one of several standard formatting options. And that's more or less the entirety of the data visualization model in the standard box. It might let you tweak a few details here and there, like make the pie chart a different color, for example, but it doesn't really open up to branching too far out of this. The standard box model says essentially, even if you can tweak this or that detail, at the end of the day, the core of what you're trying to do looks pretty much like this. For example, in the standard box model, you might want to change a color here or a color there, but the standard box model doesn't want you to implement any highly customized formatting or formatting driven by the data itself, for example. Or, again, for another example, you might want to use a slightly less common database, for example, but the standard box model doesn't want you using, say, a raw data stream, like from a sensor, for example, or live data that's coming in real time, or a highly non-standard data file that isn't usually used in data processing. The standard box says you pretty much want to stick with standard data sources rather than anything too creative. Or, just to give you one more example, in the standard box model, something you notice is that everything sort of flows one-directionally. There's no going backwards from the standard chart to doing more with the data visualization technology or more with the standard data sources. So in the standard box model, you might want, say, some basic interactivity in your chart, but you don't want, say, an arrow going from the chart back to the data where you're fetching new data based on what the user interacts with in the chart to give them more relevant information. Or you don't really want an arrow going here back to the data visualization technology in order to, say, generate another chart or more visualization information depending on what the user is interacting with. And I could give you a few more examples if you like, but I think you get the picture. The standard box model works very well as long as you're sticking pretty closely to this limit, but as soon as you start pushing a little bit too hard in any one direction, it starts vetoing some of your ambitions. Now, the big question. Where does Native SDK fit into all of this? If your problem happens to fit perfectly within the standard box of data visualization, you don't need anything beyond the bounds of what comes normally. You could still use Native SDK for that. It would work out just fine. There's no problem with that at all. The cases where Native SDK tends to shine the brightest, however, are those when you do want to bend the rules of the standard box a little bit. For example, some common cases where that might happen would be, say, you have an unusual data source that you still want to visualize, or you have a very complicated or very precise vision of how your chart's formatting should be. Or, here's a big one, your chart isn't a pure output. You might, for example, have a website, and you want your chart to integrate seamlessly with everything else that's going on your site. And you could replace website with some other kind of app, and same idea applies. In the standard box, that doesn't happen because the chart is just an output, not some interactive element, but it works wonders with Native SDK. Or, again, another example. Maybe you're only visualizing a certain part of a dataset, and you might want to gain extra data, whether this be like live updates from a server, or just some additional data file that only some users might be interested in, or only makes sense to provide on demand. That works much better with Native SDK than in the standard box. Or, here's another one. What if everything really does fit in the standard box? What if you really don't need anything outside of this? But your configuration is just really complicated and nuanced. Maybe you have like several different data files or databases along with data files. And maybe you want several different outputs with several different relationships with each other. And maybe they're running in different technologies, and who knows what it is. But one way or another, the details of your data visualization setup are just very nuanced. Native SDK can probably handle that much better than other solutions. These are all cases, in fact, just where Native SDK is an excellent choice, and it can really set itself apart from other options in data visualization. Now that does raise the question, when wouldn't you want to use Native SDK? The main reason you wouldn't want to use Native SDK for something is mainly because it requires a little more effort to use. You do have to do some light coding to set up the configuration and integrate it with whatever you need to make things work. So that's one consideration you will want to take into account when deciding whether Native SDK is right for your problem. And, by the way, if that is a concern for you, but you otherwise like what Zoom Charts can offer you, you might be a good candidate for using our Power BI visuals, which can offer a lot, not all, but a lot of the features of Native SDK in a slightly easier to use format. So definitely consider checking that out if that describes you. Otherwise, though, in general, just to summarize the advice on whether Native SDK is right for you or not, if you think your use case might stretch the bounds of the standard box a little bit, or if you don't think some light coding to set up your charts is a big deal, then Native SDK is probably a fine choice for whatever you're trying to do. Now, I'd like to close out with a real-world example where Native SDK is a really effective data visualization solution, and how you can use the concepts we've talked about in order to recognize that potential in advance. So, in this case, our data visualization problem has to deal with source code. Again, this is a real-world example coming from something we've encountered here at Zoom Charts, and I'm sure many other people have encountered if they've ever dealt with software. Namely, we have a source file that, over the ages, has gradually accumulated much more behaviors and functionalities and responsibilities than really should be present in a single file. The question then is, how can you possibly figure out how to separate out all these different abilities this file has accumulated over the years without breaking all the behaviors that the software has come to rely on? In other words, how can you effectively refactor the source code? And this is a very difficult problem because there's virtually no limit to how complicated these different relationships can be, and there's really no good way to understand them other than have a sufficiently talented programmer review the source file and painstakingly figure out what's the best way to separate out these behaviors. Now, there are two critical observations that need to be made at this point. The first is that this problem is potentially a great candidate for data visualization in the first place. And the way you'd recognize that is, well, everything you need to solve the problem is already present in the data itself. The file itself already contains all the different variables, all the different functions, all the ways that the variables and functions relate to one another. So this could easily be visualized and more easily solved if only there was a tool that could effectively visualize all those relations in an easily understandable way. That's the first key part of any data visualization solution, recognizing that data visualization can be applied in the first place. The second key observation is that we're dealing with a non-standard source file. You notice in our standard box of data visualization, we of course expect relatively standard data files to go into data visualization technology. And this is the key way this problem violates the standard box, because we have a non-standard source, in this case a TypeScript file. So, if we put those two observations together, along with what we just learned about when native SDK can be applied, we take away, okay, visualizing the relationships in the source code is a great candidate for data visualization. But this violates the standard box because this is a highly non-standard data source. And therefore, this is a data visualization problem that's potentially an excellent candidate for native SDK. And indeed, it is, as I will demonstrate. What I have here is essentially the setup code for native SDK. This is what allows us to visualize this TypeScript file using native SDK. I will go ahead and run that for you. And you see it generates our visualization, which if I start up, looks a little bit like this. So all these nodes represent different elements from our original TypeScript file. And once I have this, you might notice the problems become a lot easier, because I can immediately see things like, okay, this section seems not entirely, but pretty, it only has a few things in common with the other. So there's at least two broad centers of functionality here. If I look a bit closer, I can even notice things like, okay, all the arrows are only going into this sort of area. So this is also potentially another submodule of functionality. If I can separate that out a bit, just for visual effect. And maybe even this. This is a little bit more of a stretch, but that's also a potential area of additional functionality that I might want to look at. And whether or not those end up turning out to be right or not is almost besides the point. The point is, we've taken a task that originally would require careful review by an expert, and through appropriate use of data visualization, we've turned it into a task that can be done by a non-expert in just a few minutes with a little bit of observation. And that's the power of data visualization being applied properly. And this is an example of how you can recognize data visualization potential that would otherwise be extremely difficult to take advantage of if you didn't have a tool like Native SDK to help you do the job. By the way, in a way, this is a little bit of an extreme example, because we actually have to do some parsing of the TypeScript file in order to generate this data visualization, or more accurately, in order to feed the contents into SDK, which will generate the data visualization. And I intentionally chose this example for that reason, because I can show you, even in a case where you have to do that much work yourself, which is not common, by the way, but even in a case where you did, the source code in total, as you see here, is just under 166 lines of code total. So this is not some massive code job to make this happen. This is something that, again, with a little bit of light coding on your side, even in this case, which is a little bit radical, you can pretty quickly get going with a data visualization. And in cases where you're doing something less extreme than parsing a source code file, you can often get away with even less code than that, by a significant margin. So let's talk about what we've learned. We learned about the standard box of data visualization, which most data visualization packages deliver. We've learned that Native SDK will work just fine in those cases, as long as you don't mind doing the light bit of coding it takes to initialize ZoomChart's Native SDK. But we learned that Native SDK especially excels in cases which need to bend or completely demolish the rules of the standard box. And hopefully I've shown you how this bending and breaking of the box can unlock new data visualization potential that might previously have been impossible or completely unrecognized. And lastly, you've now learned how to recognize in advance cases where Native SDK can be a highly effective solution to data visualization problems that you might encounter. That's what we covered in this lesson. Now that we know when to apply Native SDK, though, next time we'll start talking about how to apply it, starting with data. How can you get your data, whether it be in a standard data source like a data file or a database, or a highly non-standard data source, how can you get those into Native SDK and start visualizing something with it? That will be the topic we take up in the next lesson, and I look forward to seeing you there.